Most people think stagflation is a rare accident. Something that happened once in the 1970s. Bad policy. Bad luck. Oil shocks. A mistake that modern central banks learned from. That belief is comforting. And completely wrong. Stagflation is not an anomaly. It is what happens when a system runs out of clean options. When growth slows, prices keep rising, and policy tools start working against each other. Right now, most people are watching inflation numbers. Others are watching interest rates. Some are watching stock markets. Almost nobody is watching the structure underneath. Because stagflation doesn't announce itself with a crash. It creeps in quietly. Wages fall behind prices. Growth stagnates, but costs keep rising. Living standards erode without a single dramatic event. By the time headlines start using the word stagflation, the outcome is already locked in. This video is not about fear. It is not a prediction. It is an explanation of incentives, timing, and system behavior. Because once you understand how stagflation actually forms, the uncomfortable question becomes unavoidable. What if this time, it isn't avoidable at all? Stagflation is usually explained backward. People start with symptoms, then invent causes that fit the story. High inflation. Low growth. Rising unemployment. The explanation is often framed as a policy failure. Something governments did wrong. But stagflation is not a single mistake. It is a collision between constraints. To understand why it may be inevitable, you have to stop thinking in terms of short-term decisions and start thinking in terms of system limits. Modern economies are built on three assumptions. First, that growth can be stimulated when needed. Second, that inflation can be controlled with interest rates. Third, that labor markets will adjust smoothly over time. Stagflation occurs when all three assumptions break at once. Let's start with growth. Economic growth depends on productivity, demographics, energy, and capital efficiency. For decades, growth was supported by expanding populations, cheap energy, and rising globalization. Those tailwinds are fading. Populations in many developed economies are aging. Workforces are shrinking or stagnating. Global supply chains are fragmenting rather than expanding. Growth becomes harder not because people stop trying, but because the inputs themselves become constrained. Now look at inflation. Inflation is often treated as a demand problem. Too much money chasing too few goods. But structural inflation is different. It comes from persistent supply limitations, rising input costs, and policy choices that protect stability over efficiency. Energy transitions raise baseline costs. Geopolitical risk increases friction. Debt servicing costs rise as rates increase. Even if demand cools, prices do not easily fall back. Then there is employment. In healthy systems, slowing growth reduces inflationary pressure. In unhealthy systems, slowing growth exposes rigidity. Companies cannot easily cut costs without cutting output. Governments cannot tighten policy without destabilizing debt. Households cannot reduce spending without reducing living standards. This is where stagflation lives. Not in any single decision, but in the gap between what the system needs and what it can realistically do. The reason stagflation feels confusing is because it violates expectations. People expect trade-offs to work cleanly. Raise rates, inflation falls. Stimulate growth, employment rises. Stagflation breaks that logic. You can slow the economy without stopping inflation. You can fight inflation without restoring growth. And once the dynamic takes hold, policy becomes reactive rather than proactive. At that point, the system is no longer steering. It is absorbing damage. This is why stagflation is so difficult to reverse once it starts. And this is why focusing on short-term indicators misses the real signal. The real signal is constraint. When an economy becomes constrained by demographics, debt, energy, and political limits at the same time, options narrow. Stagflation is not the cause. It is the outcome. And the conditions that create it are not temporary. They are structural. Stagflation does not begin with prices. It begins with constraints. There are three forces that quietly remove flexibility from an economy long before people notice inflation or slowing growth. Debt, demographics, policy timing. On their own, each is manageable. Together, they trap systems into outcomes nobody explicitly chooses. 1. Debt removes policy freedom. Modern economies are built on debt. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt. For decades, this worked because interest rates kept falling. Lower rates made old debt cheaper. New borrowing felt painless. Growth covered inefficiencies. That era is over. When debt levels are high, interest rates stop being just a tool for inflation control. They become a threat to system stability. Raising rates does three things at once. It increases government borrowing costs. It pressures companies already operating on thin margins. It raises household expenses without increasing income. In theory, higher rates reduce inflation by slowing demand. In reality, when debt is high, higher rates often reduce productive investment faster than they reduce prices. Companies delay expansion. Governments protect spending through deficits. Households cut discretionary spending, not essentials. The result is slower growth without a clean drop in inflation. At that point, central banks face a dilemma. Raise rates further and risk breaking the system. Pause too early and allow inflation to persist. This is how inflation becomes sticky. Not because policymakers want it to be, but because the cost of eliminating it becomes politically and financially unacceptable. Debt does not cause stagflation directly. It removes escape routes. 2. Demographics slow adjustment speed. Economic systems depend on people more than models. Workers, consumers, taxpayers. For most of modern history, populations were growing. Labor markets expanded. Younger workers replaced older ones. That made adjustment easier. Today, many major economies face the opposite trend. Aging populations, lower birth rates, shrinking workforces. This changes how inflation and growth interact. When labor is scarce, wages rise even when growth slows. When productivity growth is weak, higher wages feed into higher prices. When populations age, consumption patterns become less flexible. Older populations spend differently. They save differently. They react differently to interest rates. This reduces the effectiveness of traditional policy levers. Rate hikes that once slowed demand now strain retirees, healthcare systems, and public finances. Stimulus that once boosted productivity now often supports consumption without expanding output. The economy becomes slower to adapt. Prices move faster than productivity. Costs adjust upward more easily than downward. This asymmetry matters. Stagflation thrives in systems where adjustment speed slows but cost pressures remain. 3. Policy timing makes problems visible too late. Most economic decisions work with long delays. Interest rate changes take months or years to fully affect inflation. Fiscal policy impacts unfold over budget cycles. Structural reforms take even longer. But political systems operate on short timelines. Elections, approval ratings, public sentiment. This creates a timing mismatch. By the time inflation becomes visible to households, the underlying causes are already embedded. By the time growth slows enough to alarm policymakers, previous stimulus is still flowing through the system. This leads to overlapping policies working against each other. Tightening to fight inflation while still spending to prevent recession. Raising rates while running deficits. Calling for restraint while protecting key sectors from adjustment. None of this is irrational. It is the result of incentives. Policymakers optimize, no crash. No single mistake. Just layers of decisions that prioritize delay over resolution. Why these three forces reinforce each other. Debt limits how far rates can rise. Demographics reduce how quickly growth can respond. Policy timing ensures corrections arrive late and overlap. Together, they form a closed loop. Inflation cannot be crushed without damaging growth. Growth cannot be restored without tolerating inflation. Attempts to balance both slow the system without fixing either. This is why stagflation feels frustrating. Nothing seems broken enough to force change. Nothing works well enough to restore balance. The system enters a holding pattern. Living standards erode quietly. Costs rise unevenly. Opportunities concentrate rather than expand. And because the effects are distributed over time, responsibility becomes hard to assign. This is not collapse economics. It is stagnation economics. And once embedded, it becomes the baseline. Not because it is optimal, but because every alternative appears worse in the short term. Stagflation is not caused by bad decisions. It is caused by aligned incentives producing unintended outcomes. Markets act rationally. Governments act defensively. Households act cautiously. Each response makes sense on its own. Together, they lock the system into stagnation with inflation. 1. Markets protect returns, not stability. Markets do not care about social outcomes. They care about risk-adjusted returns. When growth slows and inflation persists, capital behaves predictably. It avoids long-term productive investment. It favors assets that protect purchasing power. It moves toward scarcity, pricing power, and financial leverage. This shifts capital away from expansion and innovation. Factories get delayed. Hiring slows. Productivity gains weaken. Prices, however, do not fall. Companies with pricing power raise prices to protect margins. Firms without it cut costs, not prices. Markets reward earnings stability over output growth. This is not manipulation. It is incentive alignment. Capital does not fix stagnation. It adapts to it. 2. Governments stabilize today at the cost of tomorrow. Governments face a different constraint. They cannot allow rapid unemployment spikes. They cannot tolerate sudden collapses in living standards. They cannot raise taxes or cut spending aggressively without backlash. So they smooth. Subsidies replace adjustment. Deficits replace reform. Temporary measures become permanent. When inflation persists, governments often respond by shielding voters from its effects rather than eliminating its causes. Price controls. Targeted relief. Sector-specific bailouts. These policies reduce visible pain but preserve structural inefficiencies. Growth slows because resources are misallocated. Inflation persists because costs remain embedded. Governments are not choosing stagnation. They are choosing delay. But delay compounds. 3. Households become risk-averse at the worst time. Households behave rationally too. When prices rise and growth slows, people protect what they have. They spend less on non-essentials. They delay major purchases. They save defensively. This feels prudent. But at scale, it weakens demand for productive sectors. Businesses see lower sales expectations. Investment falls further. Hiring slows. At the same time, households face higher costs for necessities. Housing, food, energy, healthcare. So even reduced consumption does not lower inflation meaningfully. Spending shifts, not disappears. The result is slower growth without price relief. 4. The feedback loop that creates stagflation. These behaviors reinforce each other. Markets reduce investment because growth is weak. Governments protect demand without fixing supply. Households reduce risk-taking. Each action is defensive. None is malicious. But the combined effect is paralysis. Productivity stagnates. Prices remain elevated. Opportunities narrow.
The system stops moving forward and starts preserving itself.
This is the defining feature of stagflation. Not chaos. Not collapse. But immobility.
Why stagflation is hard to escape?
To escape stagflation, someone must accept short-term pain. Markets would need to invest despite uncertainty. Governments would need to allow adjustment.
Households would need confidence in future gains.
But incentives discourage all three. Markets are rewarded for caution. Governments are punished for discomfort. Households are exhausted.
So the system chooses endurance over resolution.
That is why stagflation is not announced. It is absorbed. People adapt to lower expectations. Growth targets shrink quietly.
Inflation becomes background noise.
Not because it is acceptable, but because it becomes familiar. Stagflation does not end because policymakers get smarter.
It ends because something forces the system to change.
History is consistent on this. Stagflation breaks only when incentives are reset.
And incentive resets are never gentle.
1. Stagflation ends from outside the economic system. Internal tools rarely fix stagflation. Interest rates are too blunt. Stimulus worsens inflation. Austerity worsens stagnation.
So the system waits.
Resolution usually comes from forces outside normal policy control. Technological shocks.
Energy regime changes.
Geopolitical realignments. Debt restructurings. Demographic shifts. These events do not optimize the system. They force it to adapt. 2. Productivity shocks reset the game. The cleanest exit from stagflation is a productivity shock.
Something changes how value is created. New energy sources lower input costs. New technology reduces labor intensity.
New processes unlock scale.
When productivity rises faster than prices, growth returns without inflation.
But productivity shocks are rare and uneven. They create winners first, adjustment later. And they usually arrive before the public realizes what is happening. 3. Debt resets are the other exit. When productivity cannot rise fast enough, debt becomes the pressure point. High debt amplifies stagflation. Interest costs rise. Fiscal flexibility disappears. Growth is taxed by servicing the past. Eventually, something gives. Inflation quietly erodes debt. Defaults restructure it. Policy rewrites the rules. None of these are politically marketed as resets. They are framed as emergencies. But the effect is the same.
The system sheds old claims so new growth can emerge. 4. Why policymakers avoid these solutions?
Productivity shocks cannot be scheduled. Debt resets are unpopular. Both create disruption. They reprice assets. They expose weak balance sheets. They break assumptions people relied on. So policymakers manage decline instead. Not because they want stagnation, but because controlled stagnation feels safer than uncontrolled change. Until it isn't.
5. What this means for the current environment.
If stagflation becomes entrenched, the question is not, how do we fix it quickly? The question is, what force eventually forces adjustment? Markets begin positioning early. Institutions prepare quietly. Public understanding lags. This gap is where confusion comes from. People expect resolution through normal tools. But normal tools preserve the status quo. Stagflation ends when the status quo becomes unsustainable. 6. The core truth. Stagflation is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of incentives to allow change. The system does not break because it is broken. It breaks because it finally has no choice. And when it does, outcomes move quickly. Not predictably. Not evenly. But decisively. Stagflation does not arrive with a warning.
It does not begin with a crash or a single decision. It forms slowly, as constraints replace choices.
Debt limits policy freedom. Demographics slow adjustment. Timing ensures every response arrives late.
None of this requires incompetence or bad intentions.
It requires a system that prioritizes stability over resolution. That is why stagflation feels confusing. Nothing appears broken enough to fix. Nothing works well enough to restore balance.
Growth weakens without collapsing. Prices rise without exploding. Living standards erode quietly.
This is how systems endure pressure instead of resolving it. Understanding this does not give easy answers. It gives orientation.
When you stop expecting quick fixes, the behavior of markets, governments, and institutions becomes clearer.
This channel exists for that clarity.
Not to predict outcomes. Not to offer shortcuts. But to explain how modern systems actually behave when they reach their limits. Because once you understand the structure, confusion stops being personal.
Subscribe CTA, 15 to 20 seconds.
If you want calm, structured explanations of money, power, and economic systems without hype or panic, subscribe to Rich Simplified. New long-form videos break down complex financial realities so you can see the system clearly, not emotionally.